what I've seen from following you online and what appears to be this obsession with vinyl, of course, but specifically the 90s and 2000s vinyl, as we've kind of been talking about a little bit, you've been a part, I mean, you personally been a part of a lot of 2000s and 90 era reissues or first-time pressings that I've seen, that I've been into, that I own. What is it about this era? Is it, for you, is it nostalgia? Is it just like your own personal nostalgia? It also happens to be this really interesting era of the CD and the MP3 when vinyl was probably at its lowest point, and therefore a lot of these great releases just never got that vinyl treatment. So I'm just kind of curious about this era, and correct, sorry if I am pigeonholing you too much, but it seems to be this kind of late 90s, early 2000s dark period where there was no vinyl.
Yeah. So there was always physical media accompanying me everywhere I went. So if it was traveling somewhere, and in that era of my life, meaning my teenage years, let's call it. So
sure,
coming up from about 1994, Green Day Dookie, the moment when I decide my musical taste is now going to define me, as opposed to something that was handed to me by an elder or something like that.
Sure.
And I had a lot of encouragement in the environment that I came up with to explore alternative avenues than just radio.
Mm-hmm.
And, the late 90s suffered from its own musical identity crisis, and ironically allowed a lot of independent seeming artists to have a very brief moment in the sun, in a similar way that somebody can go viral now on YouTube or something for a quick moment that they had that was funny or memorable. That's kind of how music was structured from a record label standpoint in the 90s. So it offered a lot of variety in terms of content for somebody to go pick up a CD like Chumbawamba and then think you're going to get a lot of songs that sound like tub thumping, when in reality you've got this very confrontational, political, bizarre music that nobody had ever heard before and wasn't expecting. Or the fact that these little shiny summer moments where an entire genre rises to the surface and then very quickly goes back down again underneath into the ocean of broader music, it sort of piqued a person like me to have greater curiosity, do a ton of methodical research into the entirety of that genre. If it was ska music, if it was alternative music that was sort of packaged as radio pop. But to me, I started to learn about late 80s college rock and the REM replacements and Miracle Legion of it all. And those people just being informed by, go back as far as like the Byrds and people who played the very first Rickenbacker guitars, for that sort of to become a shimmering, trendy way to discover music through buying CDs, which were affordable to me at that time, at $12 a pop or something like that. I'd always put them into booklets. I was the guy who did not just put a CD into a booklet and bring that 200 CD binder with me where I went, but I would put the liner notes and I would study them. I would bring the back of the jewel case. I'd pull that out and put that into my CD binder as well with me, so that I could speak to the tracks. And having that experience with music as being all-encompassing, multisensory. My eyes are perceiving something different than my ears are hearing while I'm listening to this music. My brain is getting activated by noticing similarities in the band thank you notes of bands I've never explored or heard of, but they keep getting mentioned by my favorite bands over and over again. So I better go explore that, and it better lead to another rabbit hole of genres. And pretty soon I've got a pretty massive album library, and Punk 7 Inches definitely introduced me to the concept that vinyl could be an enhancement tool and experience at a show. So more than merch, being a t-shirt and a band that I wore proudly, I would have these B-sides and unheard of unreleased tracks on this vinyl medium specifically. So that's where it sort of begins. It begins in MXPX. It begins in punk rock communities and shows. And the ability to take that 7-inch with me felt a lot tactily like a CD, But it's kind of different. It was kind of unique artwork. It probably would have been artwork, especially within punk rock records, that wouldn't have been safe for CD shelves at a record store or at a Walmart or something like that. Maybe a little more confrontational.
Yeah.
First vinyl record I ever buy is MXPX Small Town Minds, which features these two folks from Todd. So what's Todd's last name? But he made the movie Freaks, and there was these two folks who had microcephaly on the front of the Small Town Minds tour. And, Todd Browning, that was what it was. The little old man in the library up in my brain had to find it. But Todd Browning made this movie in like the 30s called Freaks, it's like a horror movie basically. And they were on the front of the MXPX record. And that stuff probably wouldn't have been safe for not only record stores, but certainly not Christian bookstores.
Right.
Where oftentimes those albums were sold.
That's
did I
right.
answer your question, or did I go?
You did great. Well, let's keep going, because it's interesting you describe the 90s as this kind of like misfit. Like we try to attach grunge to, we just say 90s was grunge, but that's like far too simple of a definition. I mean, there was just so much happening because, and not just in the independent scene as you've described, but on the radio, we would have a big band song, and we would have a ska song, and we would have a dark goth metal song, and there everything in between. And it was really a free for all. I don't know, maybe I'm a bit grumpy now, but like it does seem like the radio is a little bit more homogenous today than it would have been in the 90s. But going back to vinyl, was that there was physical media, no doubt. CDs ruled everything. But I do feel like all the way up until even perhaps 2010, there just wasn't, there's still a lot of releases today that haven't been done on vinyl. And I feel like that's where you come in.
Yes. So not only, I was just talking to a friend called Justin about this, who has also got in on the vinyl from the 90s. Obscure promo copies only existed for television show performances. So they do a little batch, because at that time in the 90s, there was nothing cheaper, even cheaper than CDs. There was nothing cheaper for a record label to make than a vinyl record. And obviously a 12 by 12, it shows better on the desk of Jay Leno or on the desk of Conan O'Brien. So they do these really small promo only radio copies. Some radio stations in the 90s, believe it or not, were still only spinning records on turntables. So if Counting Crows was popular, they had to have some option for Counting Crows and the radio to exist. But they were done so limited that pretty much right out of college, which for me was 2006, I began sort of hounding very small groups of folks in collector communities about, where do I get Counting Crows on vinyl? Where do I get 90s stuff that I have nostalgia for on CD, but I want to actually hear it maybe in a different way than I've ever heard it? Sonically, I'm noticing there's some layers within vinyl as a format, as long as you have a good enough turntable, that are adding to my experience. So can I get any of these records? And I would say, if I put a list together of 10 albums that I wanted to hear on vinyl from the 90s, only 3 had ever been pressed out of those 10.
Wow.
Just taking a nice round number, so 30%, something like that.
Yeah.
And where do you find it? Maybe Japan. Maybe it was something that was obscurely sent overseas once the radio stations and the record label who was done with that album cycle were through with it. Those things would just sort of disappear into the ether. So laughably, in 2006 to 2010 or so, I'm scooping up all these 90s titles, first pressings, for usually around $30, maybe, which is more of a commitment than CDs, but it is also now laughably low priced compared to what some of these original pressings will go for. And always insistent that I listen to it. It wasn't like I'm going to buy a sealed record. I just bought, or I had a friend send me a Lisa Loeb record called Tales that came out in 1995. This thing is impossibly rare. Promo only. The copy that he sent me was still sealed, original hype sticker. First thing I do when I see it is I open it up and I let that thing breathe and put it on the turntable for the first time in over 30 years that this thing has ever been touched, because I'm just a tactile guy like that.
Yeah.
I'm sentimental, not particularly nostalgic about the 90s. I don't think the 90s was a better time. I don't think the 2000s was a better time. I just think from a sentimental person who likes to have some sort of physical representation of these different eras of my life, I'm just as enthusiastically a collector of vinyl from 2022 as I am from 1996. I think that the audience, like yourself, men and women of a certain age who remember a certain tactile experience holding physical media and these bands, mostly by CD, to see a list of 50 titles that brings them all back instantly, awash with memories of when they heard each one of those things, is a comforting feeling.
100%.
And I also am insistent now, more than being a collector, to reproduce these things and start to tell the story of them, not about what happened in 1996, but what the artists have learned in 2026, 2027, 2040. As these artists are aging, I want to know their reflections upon a time in their life that they're never going to get back, that everyone can relate to as a reader. I don't think the readers care too much about who mixed what, how many days they were in the studio. I think all that stuff is for other mediums, like a podcast or a documentary film or a Wikipedia page. But if you're going to hold a vinyl record in your hand and you're going to do something more with it, like read about it, let's tell the story that most people are holding that record are going to relate to, which something about that musician's experience still resonates with me and my experience in life.
Well, that's really interesting. And I find that you would probably get, especially when you're talking 20, 30, 40 years later, you would get probably a more mature reflection on that period, as opposed to interviewing an artist about a record they released 5 years ago. They're probably a little bit, or 10 years ago, they're maybe a little bit more ashamed of that earlier work. But when you get to 30 and 40 years beyond, they maybe can reflect with a little bit more distance and a little bit more, perhaps, nostalgia.
I think also a lot of those folks, now they're not trying to make their comeback record. They're not trying to make the biggest record of their career. They're able to say, I wrote this debut album when I was 19. I had a catalog of 25 songs that I got to choose from. And at that point, I felt like it was the best thing I was capable of writing as a 19-year-old. Would I ever write those songs the same way today? Of course not. However, we can all relate to being 19 and just going for broke for whatever the thing is. It could be artistic, musical, sports related, athletics. Like, you just have a different zeal and time, quite frankly, to devote to all of those extracurriculars. And people that are older who can talk about it from that perspective and be grateful about the whole experience are really fun to read and tell the stories for in vinyl packaging. I don't love the people who are like, I got screwed over on my contract.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. Just a real quick question about these, when you're talking about the original pressings, because you're right, and we'll talk about it later on, and perhaps even off air, but there are some of these 90s records that you're able to find for quite a lot of money, and I'm sure a lot of them were lost to dumpsters. But when a record is reissued and given an official release, does that devalue those collector's items in any way? Not to you, the collector, but just from a cost standpoint or price standpoint?
No, in fact, it makes the first pressings even more desirable because they were the super limited, super scarce.
I see.
I mean, the value of my collection, even though it's not like by volume apart from projects I'm working on for Unoriginal Vinyl, but my personal collection of 90s titles and 2000s titles, there is always a finite amount of records that were ever pressed in that era. And it's always south of 5,000 units. And when you're talking about a band that has sold 10 million copies of something, for there to have only been 5,000 or 500 copies of something ever that you can get your hands on, as time is going on, it's like the Beatles stamped every single White Album with a foil stamp, but the people want those first 5,000. You can get a number underneath that number of 5,000 as opposed to number 50,746.
Yeah.
Special, especially if it's in good shape and you're keeping it in good condition. So I don't see it being one of those things.
That's a good point.
Honestly, and the reissues are not made the same way at all. They're made from a digital master, oftentimes. So something that has been put into a digital format and archived. Oftentimes, these original pressings are analog recordings. So DAT tapes or analog recordings that have been pressed directly into lacquers and then metal stampers in a process that doesn't even exist anymore.
Right.
The machines are different themselves. They hold different components. And so I can A/B a reissue of Smashing Pumpkin and Siamese Dream and then listen to the Caroline Records 1993 pressing next to each other. And it's a completely different sonic experience. And there are people who just value that alone. They'll pay any amount of money just to have that first experience.
Well, I also think, and I mean, I have some bootlegs from the 1970s and 1980s, and I just love the idea of, I have a record from 1984 that is sealed, and I love the idea that there is air inside of there from 1984. You know what I mean? That's what I love, is just to open this record and be like, the dust in there is 40 years old.
Well, I didn't even think about that as I opened Lisa Loeb the other day, but that's such a good point. Like, that record's air is the same air I breathed during like Crystal Pepsi time.
Yeah. Pre Y2K, before everything.
That's so wild. Yeah, dude.
Okay,
cool.
So how did you get into? So we go back. So you have this attachment to physical media, and it evolves from CD to vinyl. How did you get into helping labels and artists bring these older releases to life? How did you make that your job?
When you see enough of the things that you love and hold dear to you, like artists and musicians and titles that are starting to get reissued around 2014, sort of the birth of a vinyl collecting community on like Instagram or something starts around 2012 to 2014. People start to find each other, start to talk about these reissues, talk about the good, the bad, the rare, the super common, and start doing their little trading things. One thing that we notice starts to become an often overlooked area of interest is still these 90s titles. There's not a huge persuasion from major labels in 2011, 2012, 13, 14 toward reissues, and most importantly, including the artists in with these reissues. In fact, the music industry as a whole kind of does this mass consolidation in around 2012, 2013, where a lot of labels that these artists, the one-off, one-hit wonders of the 90s, they were on these labels like Mercury, A&M. These labels disappear. They go away forever. They become part of a roll-up into the massive UME record industry. And the A&R people, their stories get forgotten, because at one point, those labels each had probably an army of A&R people managing each one of these bands. And they all have these really cool stories to tell about the second Sponge record and how well it did or didn't do or something like that. And that guy who was Sponge's A&R, Pablo, I want him to tell the story about Sponge's second record. And I want the bands to feel as if they have a say. And I don't have a lot of embarrassment. My regular career is just to communicate with people in sales, and thus to create in advance a presentation that will give an artist or a label a very clear idea of what to expect with a vinyl reissue that would include them in a way for them to tell their story, and also include an avenue for them to make a little bit of money off of their own catalog in ways that royalty checks will never do, is a very easy sales pitch. So, for example, I can show you some of the ideas that, if you can turn on my sharing, if that's even possible, I can send a request for it. But every record that we work on and have worked on for a long time involves essentially a pitch deck. So it'll tell the artist, the management team, whomever, this is what you could expect from a vinyl reissue of your work. So it's like a completed
Right.
This is what the order specs. This is the font we chose. These are all the labels and surfaces. This is the place where we chose your photography and the collage. This is all done digitally and invisibly before we even go to a record pressing plant or the label with the idea to make the vinyl record. Similar with Zach Brown, we did a live record for him, and I just pulled out Bob Seger's 9 Tonight live in Detroit from like 1979. And I said, here's the original inspiration and where we get some of the ideas for the visuals behind it. And sometimes it's completely original artwork that has no sort of story to tell other than we're inspired by the visuals behind punk rock or working class ethos, or here's some photography we found of your hometown, and here's a way to tell your story through essays. And
for sure,
doing all of these things in advance requires a great deal of discipline and a great deal of work for something that might not ultimately land that fish.
Right.
Does that make sense? It's like somebody who decides to really prepare the right kind of bait with, most importantly, a good financial plan behind it.
I see.
You can't just approach a label and say, hey, I'm Unoriginal Vinyl. I'd really like to put out this Dishwalla Pet Your Friends record because it's never been out on vinyl before. What you need on CC for that email is the singer of Dishwalla, their current management, cosign, who will basically tell the original owner of that record, not only do we cosign, we want to help promote this, we want to help bring essentially more attention to the streaming numbers for this record or single.
I see.
So in so doing, by having a physical copy of this record exist for the very first time, you're going to see the record Sony or Warner or Universal. You're going to see a boost as a result of, in some cases, these artists have created social media as a result of our campaigns to do a reissue for them. We build that into the original pitch. Say, in order for this thing to really succeed, you guys got to bring back Dogwood as a social media profile, even though it has not existed ever before. And they say, yeah, okay. I mean, we might only get 1,000 followers who still care about us in 2025. However, them telling their direct fan base, we believe in this project. In fact, we got to be included in it, which feels really special. And it feels really unique in a world of mass reproduction of Green Day Dookie for the 500th time. If you look at all the reproductions of that had existed at Target or at Walmart on different colored vinyl, there's only one that Green Day themselves got to be involved directly with, and it was that big, beautiful box set.
Interesting.
And they got to have fully collaborative. I mean, you look at that thing, it's got like paper airplanes in it with the dog flying the plane. It's got stickers. It's got 5 LPs inside of it that tell you what the original Basket Case sounded like as an acoustic song with a completely different verse structure. That's really fun. And that's where I think Unoriginal Vinyl sort of positioned itself from the jump is you see our logo on the back of a record, there's no reason to believe or be suspicious that this is just a mass-consumed product.
That's right.
It's meant for the fans who are going to really appreciate the extra bells and whistles and attention to detail that we're putting into it.
So I'm curious, what is Unoriginal Vinyl exactly? Because I didn't know that you were pitching to labels and to artists. I thought it was the other way around. I thought that they were pitching to you, or that they were saying, hey, we need your help to do this. So you're initiating these releases?
Most of the time, yes.
Wow, that's very cool.
There are certainly projects that people come to us, but if you look at it and you just say, what are we as a company? We're not a record label. We don't actually go sell this product ourselves. We position ourselves within the insider music industry as a digital solution, art design, and vinyl project management full service company. That can be inclusive of how long it's going to take you to get that record pressed and how many copies it's going to take you to make until you get to ROI. We can be a consultant in that area. We can show you, if you just want to order a basic vinyl mock-up for your release and you want us to have no stake in it whatsoever in co-promoting it, you can just hire us to do graphic design services for all of these different mock-ups. There's a lot of labels who hire us to do that. We do vinyl expansive mock-ups. We do ones that basically create social media packages inclusive of banners and things like that. So there's a ton of stuff out there that is just, we're sort of behind the scenes on and offer that design service to all of these labels. And as a result, they're also the labels telling each other, hey, these guys really are super, super in the weeds with music. They're super fans of music and they really love telling stories. They put out books. They've done box sets. They've done tons and tons of before after restorations. So when you look at, we'll just show them this catalog of services and we'll say, here's what the artwork used to look like. Here's how we envision it looking spiffed up. Using the original painting, using the original artwork in layers, and literally sometimes having to go and redraw one layer at a time. Or you look at this image I'm showing you of the Emery, the Question. I literally went out and bought like bottling wax and made a custom Emery wax seal that I sat and stamped every single copy with actual bottling wax onto the vinyl record itself.
Wow.
It's like going to Sotheby's to list your house instead of Remax.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Well, that leads me to my question about why is it important for you? Because like you're saying, these reissues are done to the nth degree. I mean, they involving the artists, they're going back, they're historical documents. They're basically like a mini documentary inside of a vinyl package. Why is that important for you, for a reissue to be done properly like this, to be given the royal treatment? A lot of major labels don't care. I mean, talking about this era, I have one of the first records I bought from this era was the Chase This Light record from Jimmy Eat World. That is just the digital album cover blown up. It's a black vinyl. The labels are the same as what the CD graphic was. There's nothing inside it. It's like zero effort at all. And major labels do that all the time. They're either doing a $300 box set that's still not that great, or they're doing a $30 record that's really nothing at all. Why is it important for you to do these properly?
Because you and I both know that Jimmy Eat World Chase This Light is the best Jimmy Eat World. Okay.
Thank you. Thank you.
Amazing.
It's the best album.
You're so right. And there are people out there in this world who feel the way that we do. And in a small way, we have a very small voice and a very large capability and tolerance for doing all of this in our spare time. None of us do this as our career. This is just a hobby for us. This is just something we get to do because we're enthusiastic about it. And we feel as if we have figured out sort of the secret back doors within the music industry to represent, quite literally, my graphic design partner is in Switzerland right now. He lives in Switzerland. We represent neutrality in the music industry between the artists and their ultimate pure vision, where they would get to make Chase This Light a 7 LP, and it would cost $900, and it would have every song that they ever wrote or thought about, or every Genesis, and it would probably include songs from other bands included in there because Jim Atkins knows, like, I got this little tiny part.
That's
right. That's like, you go up that x-axis, it's the band's ultimate vision, and then the labels are the ones who are just speaking raw economics. Like, I can't make less than 3,000 units. It's not worth our lawyer's time to even go and chase all the licensing and master use and publishing down, and then cut a check back to the artist, and then, you know, recoup all of the things that we needed to recoup for physical media for less than 3,000 units. And so I've explained this in the past, but Unoriginal Vinyl sits on the Z-axis toward the fans only. We are directly heading perpendicular toward what our expectations would be as lovers of this album and as lovers of this genre, music style, artists specifically. And we get to tell both the labels and the artists, no offense, but you're not the one who we're trying to really impress here. We're trying to impress ourselves, and we're trying to impress our peers. And our peer groups have very high standards, and they know what crap looks like.
Yeah.
And so we're not going for that. We're not going for, isn't it cool that this finally exists on vinyl? We're going for, I'm going to find the original DAT tapes or a rare bootleg of a show that happened in Boulder, Colorado in 1996 and include that as a bonus track in the double LP. And we know how extra it's going to cost, but somebody who picks that thing up for $40 instead of $25 is going to say, not only was that worth everything extra that I paid for it, but I'm going to keep coming back to it.
Mm-hmm,
and I'm not just going to put it on my turntable. Like, I'm going to engage with it. I'm going to interact with it for the next 20 minutes. And that's going to be my break from my phone.
Yeah,
that's going to be my,
true.
Like my respite, my place that I get to sit by the fireplace, or I get to put it on while I'm cooking dinner, and I get to have this enhanced joy of listening through it as it was kind of meant to be heard. And hearing the little nuances. I was just listening to the test pressings for this album, Never Take Friendship Personal, by this band called Anne Berlin. And they had this Symphony of Blase song. It's like track 4. And I listened to the remaster and I A-B'd it versus the 2012 press, which I was also there for at that time, which was kind of like a CD master, basically. Sure. It was good. Yeah. But this one sounds incredible, to the point where I noticed there's this constant noise of like chopping wood in the song that keeps coming at an odd interval. I never heard that before.
Wow.
So to a guy that's aging like me, I can easily remember the first time I heard that record, the CD, in the car with my buddy, and thinking, these songs are catchy as hell, man. This is so good. And you only get to experience listening to that record when you're young for the first time, kind of once.
Yeah.
This is giving somebody that opportunity to relive the actual endorphin rush that you feel by hearing a song again for the first time, because you're hearing it with new ears. You're reading a story about it. With all of the years of experience that you have now garnered intellectually that go into making the determination whether or not you identify with what that singer is saying, or whether or not you disagree with what he's saying. You didn't have that context when you're 19, when you first heard the record.
That's a good point.
You're just going, dude, this song's rad. And I idolized that. And wouldn't it be rad if my band got to tour with that band?
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah. I love what you're saying about this spectrum of like the very bottom, most economical version of the reissue, and then the very, very top. And I love that you're striking this balance, because the artist's version, as you said, and I've seen major labels pushing for this $300 or $400 target point, and there's a lot of stuff in there I'm just not interested in. I don't want a Blu-ray inside of the box. You know, there's a lot of things that they include that I'm just not interested in. So I love this idea, and our listeners can go to your Instagram and see what you're talking about. These are beautiful boxes. They're beautiful packages. They are far more than just a record and a sleeve, but not too much. Not too much to the point where it's unaffordable. And it's also, we can't have 200 of these in our collection. We don't have space for that kind of stuff. It's just...
No, I feel like I want you to have a really satisfying meal when you get to get an original vinyl package or something like that. But I feel in some cases, like, I've been on the fence on whether or not I should buy the Neutral Milk Hotel Airplane Over the Sea 10-inch box set. It's basically everything you ever recorded in and around that.
Okay.
And it's got a lot of history on Elephant Six and cool stuff like that. But I don't feel like that's consuming a meal. I feel like that's setting yourself up for like a whole dietary plan, like a regime that I gotta engage with for the next week or something. Like
that's not one.
My Tom Petty 9 LP box set. That's the Wildflowers box set. That thing is incredible. It sounds perfect. It was done beautifully. I just don't have the occasion to interact with it as much. There's a rare occasion that I do, and I'm really appreciative that it was done the way that it was. But man, I do think that there is a perfect lane in this world in 2025 for my 10-year-old daughter or a college student to buy a perfectly serviceable vinyl reissue of a record so that they can discover that music for the very first time, just as I did on CD when it was cheap. Let's have that basic version. Let's also assume that the Unoriginal Vinyl brand is catering to a different audience than that, somebody who might appreciate the details or be interested in the bells and whistles in addition to that. But also, because it's not our full-time gig, we're not full-time graphic designers, we are hobbyists doing this because we love it. it doesn't have to become such an obsession that we ride or die by. It's sell through or success.
I see.
We intentionally set up the model so that we don't involve ourselves in the commerce side. We don't take this big cut of all the sales on the work that we do. We get paid for all the work right up front. This is what it's going to cost for us to work on this project. By the time whoever has hired us or commissioned us to do the job, by the time they receive vinyl in hand to ship to consumers and presumably are selling it or doing pre-orders and stuff like that, bro, we're already out of the equation. We've already sort of set ourselves onto the next 4 projects, which is a kind of, it's a smart way to keep making in 10 years over 100 record project or something, you know?
That's pretty cool. Let's go into the details about the elements that go into a reissue. I think this is where people will find it most interesting, where I'm very interested. And I want to start with the artist buy-in, because you've alluded to that a little bit. It's evident in a lot of your projects. And I think it's now that everything is so interconnected and artists are public on social media, so oftentimes, and vocal. And talk to me a little bit about the buy-in from the artists, the old label or the current label, and how you kind of get them involved. I would imagine that this might be the biggest obstacle especially like, I'm curious about some of these bands that didn't have a one-hit wonder. They're not massively successful. They're not still receiving royalties from this release. As we mentioned, maybe they want to be like, I'm imagining like a drummer who's a full-time chiropractor who doesn't really want to be associated with this 90s release. So talk to me about that challenge of getting buy-in from the artists.
I sort of, maybe a year or two ago, I sort of set up a 10-step process for anybody who wanted to get into making vinyl reissues themselves, to start a record label that was exclusively about vinyl reissues. And there's a step-by-step process that I follow, and it's almost to a T accurate every single project we've ever worked on. So step 1, I always say, is do a lot of pre-work. You have to know everything about this record and about its context, who put it out, who owned it, who owns it now. And if that band is in any form currently existing and stating themselves on social media and operating as that band, as opposed to it just being a guy who played in Dishwalla once or Smash Mouth or whatever, are they operating in earnest as a legacy band, especially if it's an older album or something like that? So you do a lot of pre-work.
Sorry, Jason, can I interrupt you? Do you have a preference? Do you prefer if the artists are still active, they still have their social media, or do you like it when they're hard to find?
I love it when they're hard to find.
Yeah. You go into the chiropractor's office and say, hey, I want to release your record.
It's so much better that way. You want to know why? Because they treat that time in their life like most of us kind of should, as a season that has passed.
Yeah.
And so for them to reflect on it, given all of the rest of their life they have lived, not being the singer of that band from the 90s or 2000s, they have a lot more to say, a lot more integrity behind the words that they tell their fans. It gives their fans more of a sense of genuine gratitude when you're reading what they have to say, because don't need your adulation. They don't need you to be celebrating them. They have moved on with their life.
Yeah.
And that's a really cool thing. Like, I admire that stuff, and I tell them such. I say, this is really admirable that you have, in earnest, walked away from this.
Yeah. They're doing the fan a favor by revisiting it.
Correct.
Yeah.
So you do a lot of pre-work and you make up a pitch deck so you can walk the artist through your vision for the product. Starting with the artist or that individual from the band that's representing the band in earnest, showing them what the whole packaging would look like, gives them a mouth-watering taste.
Yes, it does.
It tells you whether or not it's worth even pursuing. If they are obstinate, if they are curmudgeonly, or don't have any desire to talk about that kind of stuff.
Does that happen?
All the time. Yeah. So out of like 5 pitch decks that you send out to a band, expect that 4 will come back at you saying, no, not interested. Leave us alone.
And you do? You just leave them alone?
Yeah, 100%. I got a continual Rolodex in my mind of opportunities and projects I could be working on. And I would rather work with pleasant people. So I say no to people all the time who come to me too.
Okay. But now, let's say the person is pleasant and they say, you know what, Jason, I appreciate your effort and it's very, very flattered, but I'm not interested in this. Oh, I mean, let's say that happens 3 or 4 years ago. You've been doing this for a long time. The vinyl craze, now this person probably has a 15-year-old daughter who's buying a ton of records and they're realizing, maybe I should get into this. Does that happen? Like, do people kind of like,
yeah.
Do you ever touch back with people?
Totally. I've gotten people circling back.
Yeah.
The only thing I don't like is when there's like red flags that are affiliated with it. If I show them a pitch deck, I can immediately spot a red flag in somebody's conversation with me about how they got screwed over back in the day.
Yeah.
The conversations that have to do with how much money am I going to make? Or if their management is saying, how much money does I'm representing this artist, how much money do they stand to make on this reissue? Yeah. And more importantly, who are you, buddy? You know, like there's a very kind of like managerial accusatory tone that exists everywhere.
Yeah.
Probably comes from who they have to deal with at venues and booking agents and stuff like that, because management and booking agents, that whole entire world is very unpleasant. It's not fun for me to deal with.
It was a little bit from that era too. 80s and 90s was, for labels, it was kind of a slimy time.
And I think there's a lot of assumptions right out the gate that say, now somebody's coming down, knocking on my door, hoping to make a bunch of money off of my work.
Yeah.
And so you have to, through conversation, this is a very conversational and communication-based business, believe it or not, still, as almost everything is. You have to be able to walk them through why that's not your ambition and your end game in here. You have to show them an example that establishes some pathos with them.
Yeah.
Such as, hey, the Refreshments. You guys had that big song in the 90s, Banditos. The world is full of stupid people. It was a big radio single for about 10 minutes in 1996. Do you know why I want to work with you? Because I've got this 10-inch right here that were only 500 copies made that you guys made yourselves. I really love that there's no label on the back of it. And they look at me and they look that I have this 10-inch and they're like, this isn't just some guy.
An opportunist. This is a fan.
Correct.
Yeah.
Yes. So I usually will only work with people that are interested with anyways. So I do a lot of pre-work. I build with them and I tell them my vision for the project. Step 2 is when the artist sort of has their buy-in, you give them a reason to go with you instead of somebody else. Money isn't their main incentive. Let's say they've got 5 people knocking on their doors who are curious about doing this. You give them really good reasons to believe. And usually packaging and the details we put into the packaging and the pitch deck help do the selling for us, as opposed to somebody saying, hey, Jim Atkins, we're going to do Chase This Light. And we already copied, dude, we already scanned all the CD art and blew it up. It looks great, man. We need to keep for the labels, black vinyl, and we're going to put out like 40,000 of them. It's going to be radical. So you kind of give them a reason to go with you. And then you would have to find out at that point who would pay for what. I told you, we don't pay for these reissues. We don't pay for the licensing. We find somebody who is keenly interested. Once we tell them we've got the band in our back pocket, we've got the ability to go to Warner, Sony, Universal, Capitol, whoever.
Yeah.
We need to see if label X would be interested in doing a reissue and partner with us.
I see.
Part of the partnership means our logo is going to go on the back, right next to Yori, right next to Warner's, right next to Capitol, because we're doing all of this work. We're really doing it in earnest as a way to tell our audience. Let's say there's an audience for that band. Let's say there's an audience for your label. Let's complete the trifecta and the triangle and get our vinyl head obsessives buying in as well to something that they might not otherwise think to buy, but they see the logo on the back and they're like, oh, cool, man. Let's do it. So you find out who would pay for what, and most importantly, who's going to profit from what.
And that on that point, let me ask you about that topic there. How do you know about the fan interest at that point? How do you gauge the fan interest? These fans are now in their 40s and 50s, potentially, depending on what record you're talking about. How do you know they're going to shell out $50 for something that maybe they haven't thought about since they were 17?
It's statistics and comp shopping, basically like items. So you look at Record Store Day, you look at 90s one-hit wonders who have done really, really well.
Okay.
Ones who haven't done well, you look at Spotify numbers, Apple Music numbers, you say who's continually engaged with this artist in 2025, even though this record is now 30 years old.
Right.
If the numbers don't prove out that there's anybody who even remembers that that was the band who sang that song, because there are those moments. There are the moments that just because my brain is encyclopedic and can remember every detail of every artist and every release that has come out doesn't mean most fans of 90s alternative are going to know that that was a Duncan Sheik song versus the Dog's Eye View song versus a, Edwin McCain song. They have no idea what I'm talking about when I start to rap that stuff off. But maybe Edwin McCain has never been on vinyl before. And maybe his biggest song is All B, and maybe All B has got 10 million streams a month still. Because that was not enough romantic comedies. And maybe going to Edwin McCain and showing him a pitch deck and saying, we've got a plan that allows you to have your stamp on it as the artist. And we've got a way to make you money if we license enough copies that you have your own tour variant. You want to go out there and tour the world and you want to sell your own copy for $50?
That's a good point.
We can get you your wholesale cost. And then you can sell it with an enamel pin or an autographed copy at your shows for $50. You make extra money that is direct revenue into your pocket, so you're not waiting on the royalty check. So
Unbelievable. And so I would think there's a lot of times, a lot of artists, a lot of small labels that are excited for you to do it, but I could imagine the bigger labels to say, we have a graphic design department, we have a pressing plant, we have a contract with, if you've done this homework, why wouldn't they just do it themselves?
You've shown the artist and you've gotten their buy-in. You've got the artist giving the label they were a part of once upon a time their cosign, and they're saying, no, this dude actually really knows what he's doing, and he's got at this point 100 album pedigree, including artists you've heard of, Sony Music or Warner, and we feel that this project's in good hands, and he's going to turn into you something that is worthy of a specialty release day, like a Record Store Day or something.
Yeah.
You could put an Edwin McCain record out into Walmart and I'm sure it would do well. I'm sure it's going to happen at some point because those buyers are all our age and they all remember these songs and they just want to do, at this point, unfortunately, kind of like greatest hits. Like you go to Walmart and you shop for 90s stuff. It's like the greatest hits of Cooting the Blowfish, Train, whatever. It's not like that one record that you remember. It's like kind of just...
Or even like the greatest hits albums. They're doing like the best of the 90s, best of the 2000s.
There's a rare exception where something goes really, really well. Like this Sixpence None the Richer record.
Yeah, I have that one.
Got done and released through Walmart, and it was done very well.
Yeah, it was done great. And it had a little story about the making of it and how it blew up and everything.
So when you see something special like this come about, you're like, wow, what's the difference here? How did that slip through the cracks? And you look at it and there's nothing on the back that would designate it as unique in any way. It's put out by Curb and Word Entertainment, which is like a Christian major label. But somebody who works at Curb really knows their stuff and really did a good job. We just basically were defiant in a kind of punk rock way and said, we're putting our logo on that thing. That wasn't allowed before these last decade and a half. A lot of labels would just say you cannot, you're a graphic designer, you have no right to put your logo on the back of a Universal release or a Capitol release or whatever. And we're like, no, we're not trying to be vain about this and say it's our release. That's not at all what's happening.
It's a logo of quality, a trademark of quality.
Correct.
So to speak.
It's like a seal of approval and quality. On a step 3, you found out who was going to pay for what in profit. And then you take your pitch to the major label with the artist's blessing in tow, the owner of the music, whoever still owns whatever those songs are. And you need to secure 2 licenses, right? You need to secure the master use license and you need to secure the publishing license, which most major labels own. So you have to secure both those licenses. It can either be a flat fee that these major labels will charge you a percentage of the profits that are estimated. So what I mean by that is if you assume your costs on a record are going to be $20 all in for a double LP, you're going to say the retail is $40. retail price at a record store, the major labels might say, we're just going to take a cut of that $20 profit.
Okay.
And you're going to pay it all to us upfront, depending on how many copies you want to actually press.
Right.
Or there are other licensing scenarios where you're paying for master use and publishing on a per song basis.
Okay.
So every single time that song is used, let's say it's an album that is 10 songs, and let's say that the master use plus publishing costs 40 cents per song use every time it's replicated on a new physical format, a CD or a vinyl record, you're paying $4 for that record. 40 cents times 10 songs. It's $4 upfront licensing costs, and that's pre-manufacturing. So you have to think about just all of the economics before you just willy-nilly go pitch somebody to put out a reissue. You have to say, this is what I stand to make. This is what I stand to earn. This is what I stand to lose. And then convince, in our case, another label to go front all the money for it. And then I tell that label, you're going to technically make all the money. Our cut is a flat commission fee. I'm not trying to charge percentage of sales because I frankly hate point systems and percentage sales. And it's like really hard in a tax accounting world to try to like find out that some record that's been sitting out in a distributor warehouse somewhere finally sold through 2 years later. And now they owe Uncle Sam, or are you Canadian? Is that what you are?
Yeah.
You owe money in taxes to the Parliament? I don't even know.
Sure. I mean, well, it's called the Canada Revenue Agency. That's like our IRS. Yeah. We don't have a name for him or her.
It's not fun to suddenly owe that 2 years later. So all of our projects, like we look at the whole scope of the project, how much work it's going to take to turn that mock-up on the pitch deck into an actual product. And we go, it's worth X amount of money up front. We'll do it all. And by the time that thing is like ready to go, ready to get into distribution, ready to sell direct to consumer or in record stores, bro, that might have happened 6 months ago in our minds in terms of how many other projects we're on to. It allows us complete freedom to choose as many or as few records as we want. And you want to always agree upon a minimum quantity that's worth pressing. So something else that's important that people don't realize is in the licensing world, there's usually a couple lawyers who work for a major label, and they do sync licensing as well as reissue of vinyl record licensing. They kind of do the whole thing. So if a sync licensing lawyer is the person who wants to authorize a release of master use or publishing for a song title, they're always going to chase the biggest fish. And the biggest fish are things like commercials, movie industry, placements, anything that's going to be like millions of impressions is basically like selling 1 million records in that reissue campaigns and the lawyers. So a guy who's showing up going like, I only want to make 500. They're like 500 or 50,000 or 100,000 or 1 million because it's going to be included in this movie. Obviously the lawyer is not going to bother with your turn. So a lot of labels who start up and try to be reissue labels, they get lost at that point. They try to go for some titles that are more obscure or a one-hit wonder title. They shoot for the fences. They're like, I think I can sell 500 units. And they just get laughed out of the office. You know what I mean? You have to have a smart business strategy that also says to them like, minimum of 1,000. Most likely the majors are going to be closer to 2,000 or 3,000, and a solid plan for paying the label up front. So you have to have an investment already ready to go. You can't just say, I'll pay you back when, hey, Sony, I'll pay you once all the copies sell. It doesn't work. What about $8,000 right out the gate?
What about cases where these reissues are not held by the major labels? And I understand that a lot of those little labels got swallowed up. So even when it's on a tiny little 90s imprint, you're disappointed to find out that is now under Universal or whatever. But what about if it was an independent release? How does that process work? Is that a far easier process, or is it difficult because they don't have websites? They're hard to Google. You don't know where they are.
No, I would say it's not a hard process, but what those folks don't realize is if they're inactive, they had a really hard time selling it. If the band is inactive, they were just something you remember fondly from your halcyon days in college.
Right.
That band being inactive for 20 years does not bode well for your ability to sell through those records, number one. And number two, people don't remember or think about this, but a vinyl record is made with a metal master right? This metal master is basically the negative of the audio file.
Right.
And every metal master, this is a side A, this is a side B. Each one of these metal masters by itself costs around $800 to fashion.
Wow.
Just for that. So if you're thinking about doing an independent record and making only 200 or 300 copies of it, you will not break even.
That's right.
Because the cost of the manufacturing pieces alone need you to get to a break-even point. Usually I say that's about 350 copies minimum to sell through. Like, let's say your record cost you $12.50 a record in unit cost to pay for, and then you're going to sell it for $30. You'll need to pay back your initial pressing plant fee and then all that kind of stuff. And to pull that off, you really need to sell closer to 500, but 350 is the absolute bare minimum.
I agree.
If you do no bells and whistles, you need to like have black vinyl on a single pocket jacket, pretty boring stuff with an insert. That'll be like a 250 to 350 unit in order to break even. But that gap between 350 and 500 units is probably where profit is. But let's be honest, like if your profit is $12 a record and you're self-releasing it, $12 a record times 150 units that you sold that were actually in the profitable place is not that much money.
No, that's right.
So,
yeah.
And you get price breaks, you get discounts when you do 1,000. You get discounts on cloths for the jackets, all that stuff.
So when, on that note though, of the, okay, so we have this obscure artist and you remember it fondly, but maybe it didn't sell well or nobody else seems to be interested in this reissue. Is what you're doing entirely based on original sales or original cult status or current cult status, or are there other considerations?
Other considerations would just be the unique curiosity of somebody who organically, like a band like We Three, I showed you a pitch deck for them, an America's Got Talent band who's out there touring the entire world right now with a tremendous amount of success, who's never had a vinyl release ever. And their curiosity was so interesting to us that we said, yeah, let's pursue this together and create a vision of a really cool package that will be a gamble to your audience. Your audience knows you primarily through streaming and through America's Got Talent and through tours. We don't know how vinyl will perform for your style of music. It's kind of pop, it's kind of funk, it's kind of multi-instrumentalist, it's very emotive, and it doesn't fit within the unoriginal vinyl, hardcore, emo, 90s nostalgia, whatever. It's just a thing that exists out there that we got this gift to collaborate with another creative. And you can get a vibe off of somebody. You and I can vibe right now and be like, man, I'd love to have a beer with that guy. It'd be really fun. I think we'd have a lot to talk about. Or you can meet an artist who you're just like, you know what? I wish you luck. I know 3 people who would be great referrals for you, dude. You know what I mean?
Yeah, that's right.
And so we have a lot of those artists come our way and we're just like, referral. Oh, this one is interesting though. This one actually sounds like it's worth pursuing as just something that we want to exist in the world for their sake, for their fans' sake, and for our sake.
Well, thinking about, your involvement and your personal, I mean, you talked at the very beginning about this being a passion project and a hobby. There's one record that I think you're working on based on something I saw on your social media. I've loved it ever since I was a kid. I'm pretty sure I thought I was the only one on the planet who loved this record. I tell people about it all the time. A part of me had thought about funding it myself. Like if $2,000 or $3,000, that might be worth it to have this record on vinyl. I'm curious, have you ever worked on a project that was primarily for selfish reasons that you're like, I mean, you're telling me you don't invest personally. I know you do this as a hobby.
Right.
I imagine from a place of fandom. I gotta think there's times where you're like, I just want to be a part of this. However it happens.
Yes, that happens a lot, honestly.
Yeah.
I'm doing one right now. I don't know if we're talking about the same one. We could say either on or off the air, but yeah, that's fine. 100%. In fact, I was so curious about this band I'm working with right now because they're humming along. They're doing really great. They have
Yeah.
some major airplay on the radio in the 90s. And then one day, just lights out, completely goes dark. You
Wow.
never hear or see from this artist again. And that has been one of those like dreams you have as a fan of their music, to like run into them in a coffee shop or
Yeah.
to track them down somehow.
Yeah.
And this was like 15 years of my life where I just did not hear or see anything about this artist. And they weren't even being talked about online
Wow.
in any meaningful way. And I'll just name the artist as Dog's Eye View from the 90s. They were
Okay.
a really, really great band that nobody really remembers, but you hear their song, Everything Falls Apart, you instantly know what it is.
Okay.
You've heard it 100,000 times.
Yeah.
That's a great example of one. And another one was actually a Canadian band I was obsessed with since day one of starting Unoriginal Vinyl, putting out vinyl for a band that had been around for 30 years that had never had a single vinyl release come out. They're called the Paper Boys. They're from Vancouver, Canada.
Oh yeah.
They've won Juno Awards. They are in the kind of world music / alternative
Sure.
ecosphere. And I was hounding Tom, and Tom and I were vibing as people, but he could not see a world where it made financial sense to put vinyl out.
Mm.
And it has been something that I pursued. I made absolutely happen. I made sure I pressed with a Canadian pressing plant that would give him close access to be involved in the process and
Right.
see his records getting pressed. And I knew, because this band continues to tour to this day, that even if I didn't make any money, I would invest money in order to make it back. I could make enough money back on the cost of all the goods to make 500 records. And I'm so proud. I think it's my favorite project I've ever worked on.
That's
And
amazing.
to this day, you look at, it could be Unoriginal Vinyl number 53 or something like that. I don't even know. And the people who have gotten it has clicked with them. They've been like, this is actually phenomenal music. And it's really enjoyable, and it's for all occasions.
Yeah.
It's not like a hardcore record where you have to be in a certain mood to listen to it.
Yeah.
It is just like having a wonderful drive through the mountains and listening to something you're just never heard before. Those moments of discovery.
Yeah.
Every time I've exposed people to the Paper Boys record, it's like a moment of discovery that they haven't had in a long time.
Yeah, that's amazing. I love that. What about going back into the weeds for 1 second?
Yes.
And by the way, I'm excited to turn the microphone off and talk about some other projects. But I'm curious about the audio portion of the release. Like, what are you looking for when it comes to 90s or 2000s releases, perhaps even 70s or 80s? But like, what do you need? Do you have like a kind of a certain standard with your audio? It must be original masters, or what if there is only a CD copy around? Like, what are you doing to pull this off?
I can't say everything about that process, just because some of the mastering engineers I work with, I don't know if it's part of their IP or whatever, but they've got a process now that is extremely sophisticated that does go into, when available, original master recordings. There are archives out there now with the highest available sonic fidelity and quality recordings that can ever exist for an album.
Wow.
In mass, in like museum, Smithsonian level detail in the music industry, in spite of warehouse fires destroying tapes and all these kinds of stories that you hear that are horrific. And I am just making sure that the mastering engineers that I am working with start with a really high reputation for the style of music that we're talking about.
Oh, that's cool.
And that they have a very keen insight. I'm always asking questions as to where they're getting their source material from and what their process is. And then I think more importantly about in vinyl manufacturing, there's like a 1-step, a 2-step, and a 3-step process. So if and whenever there's a budget for it, depending on the label I'm working with, always going with the highest quality mastering for vinyl process that's available. So you don't always need to make a lacquer. There's machines that can get you that metal master directly with a laser.
Right.
But if you make a lacquer with an actual needle and you create a negative of the music that way, it's going to add a lot of depth and grooves that are unique to the analog listening experience, not the digital.
Sure.
Because like you look at a digital sound wave on something you listen to on Spotify and you just were to map it out, everything is almost cut at like 90 degrees. Every parabola shape that you see,
Right.
they're very angular at the microscopic level, but analog sounds that you can create on lacquers and on vinyl naturally, because of the grooves and their limitations, have a parabolic shape, which is kind of more what they describe as the warm tone of a vinyl record.
That's right. Yeah. Yeah.
So I'm always thinking about, if I can help it, and if there's influence that I have to spend a little bit of extra money on the mastering process, I'm always gonna, and now because I've been doing it for almost a decade, I have a very short list of people that I always want to make sure I hold in the mastering. There are labels who will just say, they're not cutting corners. They're thinking about economics. They're saying, I can only make 500 copies of this record. I don't have an extra $1,000 to pay a mastering engineer to make the ultimate version of an emo record from 2000.
Have you ever worked off of like 2-inch tape or ADATs?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
Is that fun or is it stressful?
I mean, I don't love that process because it's very volatile. Every time you run those tapes through machines, you worry your something could be compromised, and that's the copy that's left, maybe perhaps in the world. I'm doing that process right now with the record, and I'm like holding my breath every time the mastering engineer is running that through these machines, because it's not just the quality of the tapes that has denigrated over time, but it's the frequency of the use of the equipment that used to get a lot of use like every single day, and now gets touched once a month, twice a year.
Right.
Once every 5 years. There's all these formats that were recorded, especially in the late 90s, that are like completely perplexing, weird formats that never existed outside of that. It was like trying to sort of bridge the gap between when Pro Tools became the primary source of recording everything digitally and when everything was converting away from analog. There was a slew in the late 90s of people who were trying to create the next biggest and best format.
Right.
And people don't realize that. So you might meet with an artist and all they have are these totally bizarre, you can't find a machine to play this format anymore.
Wow.
We go through it, man. We get
That's
in the weeds.
crazy. Yeah, that's crazy. That would be another thing I think we talked about the air from 1980 inside of a record, but just the idea of like opening an old Pro Tools session from one of my favorite albums, would be an exciting moment in itself, I imagine.
Yes, there are definitely those times when I did it with this band locally called Five Iron Frenzy, where the mastering engineer who originally recorded everything, like sitting on, listening to him and watching him just isolate the vocal track for the first time, and hearing that in a different way, or hearing he's
That's
like,
crazy.
This is the moment where the horns get taken. Here's the moment where this gets. I mean, if you're a fan of these bands and you're a fan of these music, there is no better experience to have
100%
than to get to be involved and then authorship over what at the end of the day could amount to somebody who just pulls the record out, doesn't even look at the sleeve, throws it on the record player, and just goes about their day while they know the little washover of nostalgia, like the wave hits their face. I want to be there for that person and for the person who's on the other end of it. And so they can.
One of the biggest things you do is the artwork, and that is really, I think, your trademark and your thumbprint on these releases. And recently you've kind of been exploding them out a little bit on social media so that everybody can see. And when you do pitch, or when a label like Tooth and Nail will show a release that you've been a part of, they show a lot of it. And it's very exciting to see. You touched on this just a little bit, but I think it's, the audio is a challenge to dig up and to find those source files. The artwork has got to be even harder to find, because who knows what version of Photoshop or if Photoshop even existed. You've talked a lot about having just to go back from scratch and remake those because they need to be so big. And not only that, but if you're doing a beautiful spread where it opens up and it didn't have a gatefold originally or whatnot. So talk to me about that process. That's so fascinating.
To your point, Photoshop or Illustrator didn't exist back when a lot of these records were made. Thankfully, I was around from about 2005, 2006 with Tooth and Nail as a friend of the label and a friend to all the graphic designers who worked there. Folks who, there was a studio that was in-house called Asterisk Studio that was run by a guy called Brian Clark, run on to design for Target, the Olympics. They have a brand called Invisible Creature that's fantastic. And he is a perfect archivist of a lot of this stuff.
Oh, cool.
So going to his house in Seattle and then digging through some archives to look for something like that is an enriching experience in and of itself for me. And I want to bring people along for that. I want to understand how he's not just doing Tooth and Nail or solid state stuff. He's done the great reissue packages recently for like Alice in Chains. He designed Good Kid, Mad City by Kendrick Lamar. I mean, there's stuff that this guy has done that is just unbelievable in terms of a resume and portfolio. And yet he always did those things in the world of graphic designers are paid to do a project and that's it. They don't define their brand or put it on the back of a work or something like that across all of these platforms. But he is world renowned and has been nominated for Grammys in terms of packaging and things like that.
Sure.
So I lean on not only the people who came before me and I have good relationships with them. And I'm not asking them for selfish reasons to steal their intellectual property. I literally am making fun of the idea that we are recreating work that they have already put a lot of thought and originality into. Our name is Unoriginal Vinyl. It's not accidental. We chose that.
Yeah, good point.
And I just have a very talented, unbelievably gifted partner in Switzerland called Bruno. And Bruno and I, we talk like every single day. I usually wake up at 5 a.m. So that's about 3 p.m. his time. So before I go to work, I'll get up and we'll talk and talk through projects and a vision that we'll have for the project, what will or won't work. We'll try things out together that certain positionings of things won't. Yeah. And then if and when there is an occasion where we are stumped, that's when we go do extra research. We find out who was the original painter. Sometimes we reach out to them directly and we say, we'd like you to be a part of this. In return, we can't offer much. We can't pay you a tremendous amount of money to recreate this work or to give this to us. But you know what we would love? Mr. Zayo Painter, who painted the Zayo records, we'd love for you to tell your story.
Oh, yeah.
You're a painter. You do your thing still for fun. It's not your full-time career, but like, what better way and platform for that painter to get to tell his version of what it was like to paint that original artwork than within the vinyl reissue,
That's
using
incredible.
his artwork and his restoration. Because I even say to these guys, like, dude, I'm not going to be able to recreate this as faithfully as you would prefer it. Why don't you recreate it? And you get involved in this process. And these are guys, again, if you learn to communicate the message the right way, thoughtfully, with a lot of empathy and with a lot of graciousness about what you're doing, you don't come across as some credit-grabbing spinster who's trying to start a label that's going to be world-renowned. You're just saying, let's you and I meet up sometime in Pennsylvania where you live. Let's get some appetizers or happy hour together. I now have a friend in Pennsylvania. I now have a friend in Venice Beach that are people that I've gotten to sort of encounter as a result of this. It's not just the artists that I work with, but sometimes it's just like fans. I don't consider Unoriginal Vinyl to have fans. I just consider this like the community of people who kind of have a mind about this stuff. And so I don't find myself a stranger in any city I go in the country. And I can have a conversation like the one that you and I are having never met before.
Yeah.
Because we're kind of enjoying the same stuff in life.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Well, and it's so incredible to think, and this is why I was a little surprised to hear how much of this being a passion project for you. But when you talk about all these elements and all these components, there's really no way for this to be a profitable project. And it's no wonder why the labels will just blow up the CD artwork and press it to black vinyl, the major labels, because that can then be somewhat profitable. But what you're talking about going out and meeting the artists or having the artist having to repaint the thing and every single thing along the way. And then at the very end, there's maybe only 1,000 people in the world who will buy this project. But and that's what's beautiful about it, I think.
People hate me saying this because I kind of have a little bit of a soapbox about this philosophy, but the fact that it's limited, the fact that only 1,000 people on Earth have it, is the same as only a limited amount of people get to go to the best concert of their life. Only a limited amount of people were actually there to experience that thing.
Yeah.
To post it on your cell phone or to snap photos of our artwork and just post it to social media and say, look at, this is the essay for those of you who didn't buy it. That's just kind of one of those things where you're like, you missed it, man. You think you're helping the whole community at large, but you're missing the bigger picture here, which is that these things can be exclusive. That's okay that everybody didn't get a shot at it sometimes.
Yeah.
Sometimes that creates a desire amongst consumers to say, I better not miss it next time.
That's right.
I better pay attention, maybe just a little bit. And that's how these projects get to keep happening, is with interest.
That's incredible. That's a great point. On that note, I was curious about your connection with Tooth and Nail. You said you were connected a little bit. A lot of the releases seem to be pointed in that direction or from that era. Is that just your favorite genre, your childhood? They seem to really like what you do.
I was able to sort of position Unoriginal Vinyl to Tooth and Nail as a rebrand for their vinyl reissues. At the time, they had a kind of stuck point with reissues having to go through a really cumbersome licensing process with Universal, wherein Universal controlled all manufacturing and basically would take every opportunity to maximize their own profits and cut corners with the quality of the finished pressing. Right. And as a fan of Tooth and Nail releases, I was like, man, it's so close, but it's so far away. It's almost there, but then I get this instead. This just feels like kind of a thing that exists, but it's not representative of my experience. So let's pause. I can figure out how licensing works. I can read legal contracts and understand what they're saying. And I can figure out how to do all of that paperwork for Tooth and Nail and just operate as a third-party contractor to say, I'll do it all for you. Inclusive of the work, inclusive of, more importantly, telling the artist stories. And in some labels' cases, I won't point fingers at Tooth and Nail, but I will say I have worked with labels with whom the artists have a contentious relationship or history.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, for sure.
So for me to neutrally go as Switzerland into the conversation with the artist and say, listen, man, I'm just here for the fans. I just want a really rad packaging. And they say, well, who's going to put it out? Who's going to make money? I say, we can stop this conversation now, or I can continue, and we can continue to make this thing a reality. Do you want it to exist, or do you want to get bogged down with who's going to make enough money and all that kind of thing? And I have artists that just walk away at that point. They'll say, I'm not interested. I'll say, great, I got other things to do. Then try to convince you. Or you can look at the pedigree at this point, or the resume, or the portfolio, and say, this guy kind of means what he's saying. He's going to get it done. It'll actually exist, which it doesn't exist now. And you can't make any movement forward with absolutely nothing in your hand. You know what I mean?
I was curious. This is a stupid question, so I'll use it as my last question. Is this a finite endeavor in the sense that specifically looking at this black hole of 90s to 2000 records, are we going to approach the time when they've all been reissued?
Great question. No, definitely not. My experience has taught me, when I think about the 19th reissue of Flipmac Rumors, or the 27th pressing of any Led Zeppelin records, or even some of the obscure stuff from the 70s right now, people are uncovering or unarchiving, or there's new ways to look at them. I mean, Green Day just, for the first time in history, pressed in original lo-fi, original master recording of their record on vinyl. It's $150. It's in a giant black box. And it's the first time that, in theory, you can hear the version that came out of the speakers. The first time the band heard it with Rob Cavallo in the studio when they recorded it. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So you can say that the nostalgia will wane. People have already tired on the 90s, if you're asking me. They've already tired of this sentimentality, or they've forgotten the names of the bands who were responsible for that hit song that is still playing in their local grocery store. And that's
It's true.
okay.
Yeah.
I think that from my perspective, there will always be more to experience and more to tell about the reasons that we all gravitate towards this style of physical media and music. There's always reasons to believe in it, and it hasn't gone anywhere in 135 years. I've got Edison cylinders literally in my vinyl room right now.
Awesome.
Edison cylinders and an Edison cylinder player. I can play those records today.
Wow.
And do you know who they're by? Who knows?
Right.
Nobody knows. But that exists and has endured in a way that acquisitions and mergers and labels, falling pieces. I've told tooth and nail since the get-go, I am not interested in how much money I can make you or how great the marketing is behind reissue campaigns for vinyl. I think you guys have a legacy story to tell here.
Absolutely.
That keeps people engaged with tooth and nail and their fandom for the long haul, well into their 50s or their 60s or their 70s. And as a way to pass down this story, I would rather hand somebody a vinyl record that has a really nice retrospective within it and good looking art when I'm 55. Like I said, it's not nostalgia for wishing that era existed again. It's just saying, look ahead, look at what can exist and the stories that will continue to need to be told. As an artist approaches me and said, hey, guess what? There's been 5 reissues of Jimmy Eat World, Chase This Light. But Jason, you got a different bent on the world. And I'd like to tell my story through you. Yeah. That day could come.
I hope so. There is this, what I love that you're doing, and I feel like it goes back to the beginning of that, just that realization of having a physical, that intimate connection you had with a physical record. I think back to, when we were young, and the CDs and even the cassettes before, and the cracked jewel cases, the teeth of the tray card was smushed and the CDs were scratched and the songs would skip. And because we were carrying them around with us and then into the binders and then eventually cracked and the tapes were warbled. And I just feel like what you're doing now is you're taking that and you are now giving it a proper shrine. And you're saying, these were the soundtracks of our lives. And now they're being given this treatment and they're now on a shelf. I'm not taking them anywhere with me. I just something, what you're doing, and I know other labels are doing, but what you're doing so well with our music, I just feel like it's more of an act of a historian, of a museum curator.
I hope so. I want it to be that way more than I want it to be anything else. I want it to be this thing that says, not it existed, that feeling you had, that popular culture trend towards CDs existed once upon a time. And let's all think back fondly upon the days when all we had was a Sony Walkman that skipped every time you skateboarded down the road in your headphones. I want the way that we all get to age together, the stories we tell each other about this stuff and how important it was. I wanted to say something different now. I want it to be about it existing. It exists. Present tense. It exists.
It exists, yeah.
Here it is.
Jason, thank you for your time and thank you for your work. And thank you for sharing this insider information and insights and wisdom to people who
let me
curious.
give you the quick top 10. So you want to go start a record label. I got through most of it through the conversation, but I'll give it to you in bullet pointed order here.
Please.
You want to start releasing reissues yourself. Step 1, you do a lot of pre-work. You make a pitch deck. You can take the artist through your vision for the project. Step 2, you show the artist, you get their buy-in, you give them a reason to go with you instead of someone else. Oftentimes, they are not motivated by how much money they're going to make, especially if they're just a chiropractor drummer now, right? Number 3, find out who's going to pay for what and who's going to profit from what so that you can really talk numbers with whomever you're trying to license from. Number 4, take your pitch deck with the artist's blessing in tow, hopefully CCing them on the email when you first solicit or cold call a record label about reissuing the license. to the owner of the music. There's 2 licenses you have to gobble up or ask about, which is the master use license and the publishing license, right? Agree upon a minimum quantity that will be pressed. Sometimes you don't get to have a back and forth negotiation. Sometimes they tell you there is a minimum quantity that we will allow before we authorize a license for that record.
Right.
2,000, 3,000.
Sure.
Have the money ready. That's number 6, to be paid in advance before launching your project. So do not assume that pre-orders are a good way to go to fund your project. If you don't have the capital, find somebody with capital who will invest in you and your efforts in advance so that everything can definitely be paid for. The pressing plants can be paid for, the licensing costs can be paid for, the distribution can be paid for. All of these costs that are going to go in, you have to have in your front pocket, not your back pocket, going into the ask. Number 7, figure out who's going to press the record, what they're capable of achieving technically. So everybody thinks that they want like a wax mage variant, something super fancy, something super technically made. But understand that there's a line to get a wax mage variant that is 3 years long. So think about the urgency with which you want to work with the pressing plant and what their production line capabilities are, and most importantly, their timing. Number 8, determine the method for fulfilling your online orders. Your D2C is what that's called. Or if you want to go into sort of retail distribution, how are you going to get distribution for this product? Number 9, if needed, secure that distributor for retail sales. And I always say number 10, give up or succeed, and then do it all over again.
Give up or succeed. Well, I mean, you get to stay. Is that likely you get to stage 10 and you have to give up?
I hope not.
Yeah.
I hope for the sake of all of our want and need for all of this stuff to get pressed on
right.
vinyl.
Yeah,
well,
that's right.
That
Amazing.
there are other people like me who feel exactly the way that I do, who have enough of a business acumen to say this is less about my personal feelings about how great a record is and more about the business of music, because that's what it is.
Well, and I imagine there's people like you in other genres too, that there's people doing what you do for obscure jazz and obscure Brazilian music. And
yeah, you go to like the End of All Music in Oxford, Mississippi, and there's guys that work at that record store that are all about Delta blues and
right.
New Orleans jazz and everything obscure, and they just have this encyclopedic knowledge about their regional scene, and they are doing the Lord's work for a genre that I know nothing about. And I walk in there, and to walk into a record store that has something like 20,000 records and not know a single thing that you're looking at is a pretty impressive feat after
crazy.
30 years of collecting, but it's fun.
And every genre has that record store, that situation. Yeah.